All right, let's get to it. Welcome again, everybody. I am Shireen White. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Children's Rights, a national children's advocacy organization. We have just a few housekeeping matters to start with today. This session is being recorded. We know that there were many people not able to make this live discussion, and we want to be sure that they have access to this information. We have about an hour-long discussion for you. Please enter any questions that you have into the chat. And if we're able to get to the questions today, we will do so. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you individually after to answer your questions, or we might use the questions to inform future sessions of this series. If you have any administrative or technical issues, please chat Jenny Pokempner or Taylor Vitello. All right, let's get some introductions from our amazing panelists here. Let's start with you, Alex.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Citrin, pronouns she, hers, and I'm a senior associate with the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Great to be here with everyone.
Dr. Day.
Hello, good morning / afternoon to everyone joining us today. My name is Angelique Day. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington in Seattle.
David.
Good afternoon or good morning. My name is David Kelly. I'm an attorney who's represented parents and children in child welfare proceedings. And I've also worked in state and federal government, most recently at the United States Children's Bureau. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Tashay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tashay Roberson Wing, and I'm the founder of Diaries of a Black Girl in Foster Care and a lived experience consultant.
Shonda.
Good morning. My name is Sharonda Sullivanoff. I'm the Director of Public Policy over at Children's Home Society of Washington. I'm also an impacted parent who's navigated the child welfare system and currently a kinship caregiver to my most amazing, beautiful grandson.
Thanks, Shonda. Alexandria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandria Ware, and I'm the owner of Culture Creations, Inc., and I'm also a lived experience consultant as well.
Thank you to our panelists. This congressional briefing series promoting racial justice in the child welfare system is the work of the Transition Aged Youth Coalition, which is made up of advocacy organizations across the country who do work on and with and on behalf of transition aged youth in and leaving foster care. The TAY Coalition, as we call it, works to develop law, policies, and practices that support the well-being of young people and ensure the provision of meaningful opportunities for success and advance racial justice. Future sessions will dive deeply into specific issues, including community resources and supported kinship placements. But for now, we're going to kick off this session laying some foundations on racism and colonialism in the child welfare system. We're going to hit on some history. We're going to talk about the harm of racism and colonialism. We're going to talk about the human damage that results from racist attitudes, narratives, and policies that govern our child welfare system in this country. And we're going to end with some pathways and solutions to engaging in anti-racist policy making. So let's jump right into this. We're going to start with you, Dr. Day. Can you start with a short version, I don't know if that's possible, but a short version of the history of colonialism in this country? When we talk about colonialism, tell us what exactly are we talking about?
I will do my best, Shireen. So the concept of colonialism and the practice of colonizing behavior is really centered around the ideas of elimination and erasure. We know America's child welfare system has been plagued by its complicity in the history of physical and cultural genocide of Black and Indigenous children, families, and communities through decades of government-sanctioned historical practices of forced child removal through atrocities associated with slavery, slave trade behaviors, and placement policies into militaristic or mission-led residential boarding schools, as well as through Bureau of Indian Affairs supported projects like Child Welfare League of America's Indian Adoption Project in the 1950s, which was designed to promote rapid transracial adoptions of American Indian and Alaskan Native children in white homes with the expressed intent of altering their identities and permanently separating them from their connections to their tribal communities in favor of assimilation into white families and white life ways, essentially erasing those cultural life ways, including language, cultural traditions, and thought ways, including indigenous ways of knowing and relational worldviews. These policies were in place for several decades, separating Black and Indigenous children from their families and communities. It has led to generations of young adults who have suffered from dispossession, cultural disruption, health disparities, and continued marginalization. It is not by chance that Black and Indigenous families are disproportionately involved in the child welfare system. Erasure practices continue to permeate the child welfare system today. This is not historical. This is current day practice. For example, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act or interethnic adoption provisions are current day policy examples that are based on colorblind racial ideologies that de-emphasize cultural and relational continuity in favor of increasing time to permanency. Implementation of MIPA and IEP have resulted in clear preference for stranger placement over family preservation. We know that time to permanency has not improved under these laws. Additionally, since the implementation of laws like MIPA and IEP, we've actually observed a decline in same-race adoptions and marked increases in transracial adoptions of Black and Indigenous children by white foster and adoptive parents, and a lack of effort by states in the recruitment and retention of foster and adoptive parents who identify as Black or Indigenous. System-wide ignorance of mandates that require the recruitment of foster and adoptive parents from racial and cultural groups that reflect the demographics of children in care is a form of institutionally sanctioned neglect that perpetuates harm and impedes children from achieving well-being. We know that many Black and Indigenous families do step up to foster, are prevented from being licensed, and are receiving placements. The adoption process under MIPA or IEP benefits adopters who already have power and privilege in society, those which we experience few barriers to adoption. We are talking about namely white, heterosexual, middle-class couples. While a child's race or cultural background should not be the only factor used to make placement decisions, it is clearly in the child's best interest to consider whether a prospective family can meet a child's unique needs for identity development and have the ability to promote cultural continuity for that child. For transracially adopted children, assimilation requires that children develop new social identities, which often means they must lose some awareness of their cultural origin. Disproportionality exists today because of traumatic government policies and harmful interventions that continue the cycle of disconnection and trauma.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Day. I mean, you hit on some major ideas in terms of erasure practices, identity, the need for really paying attention to the unique needs and identity development of young people. You know, I think some people might be wondering, what are some differences, or how do we sort of talk about colonialism alongside racism? How are the two distinct? How do they work together? And I'm wondering if you, Dr. Day, or you, Alex, can address that, or some combination.
Mm-hmm. I think I know Alex has prepared some remarks, and certainly in what she'll go over, I'm sure you're going to see some stark similarities, and I can support Alex after you're done speaking too.
Sure. And really, I just have a high level comment to share here, which is that, when we think about colonialism, it's really grounded in racism as a social construct, right? And that when we think about colonialism and we think about those who were colonized, they were considered a lower race. And we really see this throughout history, throughout our global history. So there is really that very close connection between the two. And really, again, thinking about racism as a social construct and how do we move forward here. So Angelique, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add, please.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think this idea of bringing up, colonization and colonizing, is we have this historical pattern. And when we talk about racism, I know folks sometimes are focused more on present day microaggressions, but understanding that history impacts how we operate today, and that it's important for us to connect those dots between historical trauma and current day traumas and how they're associated and how they feed into each other. This is a multi-generational issue.
Yeah, and
And-
thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and and if we don't institute practices to address it, we're going to see many generations to come facing these same circumstances.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us that while there's a history and colonialism and racism have played into the creation of this child welfare system, all of the harm and everything, and that racism and colonialism all is present today in the way that this stuff plays out for children and families. So thank you for setting the tone for that. I want to shift to you for a second, Alex, in terms of racism, right? CSSP has done tons of work around this, and there are so many terms that are floating about when we talk about racism. I mean, there's stuff about bias, there's stuff about institutional racism, systemic racism, and we focused a lot on systemic racism in building this congressional briefing series. So if you could sort of level set for us and give folks maybe your best definition for systemic racism, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, happy to do that. And as I talk about some of these definitions, which I'll do in a moment, I promise, I also just want to note that I think it's really important to understand through concrete examples what this looks like. So I'll provide some definitions and then also talk through some concrete examples. First, I want to start with racial justice, right? Because which we define as the proactive work and reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that result in equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all. When we take a racial justice approach to policymaking, it not only gets at the root causes of these inequities, but it also helps us to apply a proactive solution. And sometimes this is imagining something new. And it's this proactive approach that we need to apply when we're understanding and undoing systemic racism. So as you mentioned, there are different levels of racism: individual, institutional, or what we're calling here systemic or structural racism. And this systemic racism is really a feature of our child welfare system. It's embedded through historical, social, political, and institutional factors that contribute to and maintain these racial inequity. It's in our policies, it's how our systems are organized, how it organizes how child welfare functions. And that means organizing how administrators function, managers, supervisors, and even frontline staff. It guides their decision-making, and then it becomes what they're held accountable to. So if we're going to take a proactive approach to racial justice and undoing systemic racism, we need to really understand how we ourselves got here. So when we think about systemic racism, how did we get here? It's critical to understand the roots of racism in child welfare so we can proactively address them. And I know that sometimes history can seem dry and boring, but it's really critical to this approach. And as I mentioned, it's helpful to move people into examples so it feels more alive and relatable, because I know the definitions that I just walked through really do seem academic, they are academic and theoretical. So I can talk a little bit about the early iterations of our child welfare system and how this systemic racism really came to be. What we see is that children and families of color in our earliest iterations were completely excluded. They weren't deemed worthy of support from the system. So instead, when Black families were deemed as needing the same supports that white families need, instead Black children were sent to adult jails or reform schools. And as we continue through our history, we continue to see a surveillance and separation of families of color. This includes the boarding schools that Dr. Day mentioned, where Indian children were stripped of their culture, heritage, and from their families. And even as we move into more modern day history, we can look at our policies to really see the foundations and how they continue to build upon the systemic racism. So when we think about CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, which is sort of that foundational piece of legislation of our modern day child welfare system, we see a shift from social supports, a social services system, to a child protection system. This is really where we see mandated reporting formalized as well. And with CAPTA, the total number of children in child welfare and foster care fell, but the number of children in foster care and the share of Black children in foster care really exploded. So we're seeing from our very early on iterations of child welfare to our more modern day child welfare, how we're perpetually compounding and building upon the systemic racism that is already in place. And I know your next question is going to be about, well, what does this look like today? So I'll pause there, but really just thinking about how we continue to build on this. So it's not something that happened, it's done, and we check off. Our current policies really look back to this early history and are grounded in this early history, building on these existing policies.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And you also set us up with some examples of policies that were created a long time ago, but that would continue to govern this child welfare system that we have in place. And there's no question that they were built with racist attitudes, racist narratives, a devaluing of children, Black children and families, Indigenous children and families. And so I appreciate that historical backdrop, but if there is more that you want to say about the ways in which racism manifests itself today in the child welfare system, please do.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important to share these examples so that we have concrete examples of what this really looks like, taking it out of academia and really making it more applicable to us in our everyday work in our lives. And as you mentioned, right, that early history is still influencing policy today. We pass new policies, but we often tie them back to old policies. And sometimes the racism isn't explicit, but because of the foundational principles and because the earlier policies are not anti-racist, we're really just reinforcing the existing racist system and practices. So for example, we have federal dollars that continue to heavily be weighted to supporting for foster care. That's family separation. And they support the investigation and the surveillance of families rather than investments in communities outside of system. And for states that have tried to invest dollars in communities, they have fewer and fewer resources to do so now because we still tie 4E eligibility back to 1996 aid to families with dependent children income levels. So state dollars now have to fill gaps as a result of decreasing federal supports. When we also think about how we see racism manifesting itself today, it's really important to think both about policy development as well as policy implementation. Both of these are critical to how families experience the system. And because both matter so much, it makes getting the intent right in policy development even more important. So I want to talk through just a couple of examples to be more concrete. And in all of them, it's a story both about policy development and policy implementation. The first example I'll just mention is the Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA, which advocates, including CSSP, worked with Congress to pass. We can see that our attempts to support children and families through this legislation have failed in part because the policy is built on flawed structures and assumptions about systemic racism. So what we see 2 decades after passage and through implementation is that the policy has perpetuated existing disparities. The focus on permanency has resulted in more than 2 million children's parents' rights being terminated by American courts, disproportionately harming Black children and families. Further, research has shown that the way we've written the policy and tying funding to states' reasonable efforts, and also ASFA allows these efforts in certain circumstances to be waived, these reasonable efforts findings have become more of a checkbox than a true accountability mechanism for requiring systems to support families. Another recent example is the Family First Prevention Services Act, which includes prevention funding for children and families when a child is at imminent risk of placement in foster care. Family First was first developed with the intent of decreasing children in foster care by creating funding for prevention for children who are already known to child welfare, but can remain in their homes and communities with supports and services. Within the policy, there are requirements for families to be on a plan that is monitored, but for these services, the child would be in foster care. This means that in order to access these services, families have to be surveilled by child welfare. This policy does have a great opportunity to keep children out of care, that is, those children who are already known to child welfare, but problematically from an implementation standpoint, some states are working to establish workarounds to serve more children and families. But these workarounds cannot remove the requirement of surveillance. So states really are just widening the net and expanding their child welfare reach. And we know what this means. We know that this means more Black and brown families will come deeper into the system. We might be getting services into communities, but it's at a real cost for Black and brown families and one that we cannot be okay with. So even when you have good intentions, like providing funding for prevention, if you don't implement that policy in an anti-racist way, it will be problematic.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And we're going to get into a little bit more about policies. And so thank you for the examples, Alex, and thank you for pointing out the importance of both aspects of that development and implementation. I just want to ask a question, and I think maybe David can take it, or if there's somebody else, but for people who are joining us and listening right now and thinking, I'm not sure I agree. I don't know if the child welfare system is racist. I can't grasp that. I'd love if one of you could address that. How would you answer or respond to that?
Well, I'm glad to start. And it's not uncommon for people to be surprised to hear that this is an issue within child welfare, or maybe not be willing or able to believe it. But to folks that might feel that way or might have less familiarity, I just ask them to think about the fact that there are these laws and policies on the books. And we like to believe that laws and policies affect everyone the same way, that all families and all communities will experience things in the same way. But when you look at the outcomes and you look at decades and decades of data that's been reported to the federal government from states about their child welfare programs, there is a clear and persistent pattern over years and years that show very clearly that Black families and Native American and Alaska Native families are negatively impacted more than white families by this system. It's clear, persistent data. There are patterns of who is being negatively affected through interactions with the system, who is more likely to be reported, who is more likely to experience family separation, who is more likely to linger in foster care. It's Black and Native families over and over again. And if these laws were indeed neutral and equitable, we wouldn't see those patterns. So there is data to support this, and we need to pay attention to it, because the human costs and the financial costs are extremely high. So whether you're motivated by faith or justice or just bottom line economics, real harm is being perpetrated here with real costs.
Yeah, and in addition to the data, right, we have the experiences of people. People are telling us what they are experiencing when they are caught up in this child welfare system. And we're hearing from Black children, we're hearing from Black parents, we're hearing from Indigenous children and Indigenous parents what their experiences are with this system. So that's equally as important, I think, for us to be listening and listening carefully and listening with intent to act and do something about that. I do want to transition to this harm and this urgency, right? We've been talking about that data and this disproportionality for so long. Probably many of us have read Dorothy Roberts' book, Shattered Bonds. If you haven't read her new one, Torn Apart, I highly recommend it for continued education about racism in the child welfare system. And, we're hearing lots from lived experts. We're having a ton of conversations. We're issuing reports and articles. We're engaging in conversation. We're doing more research. And yet we're still right where we are right now, right? Which is an unacceptable place to be in. And so I want to turn to both Shonda and David to talk to us about the urgency of this as a policy issue, as something that we need to be acting upon. And I don't know if David, do you want to start or you want Shonda to start?
I'd love for Shonda to start.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Shireen, for the question. So in regards to the urgency, first of all, I just want to kind of go back to a little bit of why should we even care about this, right? And my question for you is how can you not? How can you not care about Black and brown families? And I think that we have a narrative that we've been fed about who families are, and we really demonize and stigmatize parents. And what we do in those moments is it removes our ability to act humanely. And so I just want to really just concentrate on that. We're hearing from folks that have been impacted, and we have to care about their experiences. No one in this world is not deemed to be treated with respect and dignity. That's just what we should be doing as human beings. I want to tell you that I think that we have a system that really forces people to comply to survive. And that survival is like indicative of this history around Black and brown families. And so we should definitely recognize that we are replicating harm. It just has a different face on it today. So for me, the urgency really is these are families, right? And I love my children just as much as you love your children. Because the color of my skin doesn't mean that my love for my children is reduced. And why as a nation do we go to a place to say that that's not true? So I think that we have to look at ourselves in a way to see others. I always like to kind of give this riddle. And what's the one thing you can't see without an object? Yourself. Mm-hmm. We are each other's mirrors. You have got to look at yourself and see how you are coming into people's lives and recognize and understand, is that something that's acceptable to you and to your family? My family is my heart. Right? It is foundational. It makes me who I am. And when we tear people apart, as we do currently, we remove parts of people's souls and we ask them to wander the earth soulless. And then we see the consequences of that. So my urgency for you is that we as people need to do better. We deserve so much more than what we're giving to each other. So I will just tell you that I think it's inhumane not to care. I'm baffled at it at some points. I'm just baffled. And that we as people, we have the information. The data tells you the story, right? We do lots of data gathering. We have enough data that tells us what needs to be done, and we're not doing enough. So I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Shonda.
I'll add only that we should care because children and families are being hurt by our current structures and approaches. And you could think of it as we're doing harm in the name of good. And that's really hard for a lot of people to acknowledge and see, especially if they've, with good intention, spent their careers focused on child welfare. But let me just share and ask people to think about this a little bit. Every 2 minutes in the United States, a child is taken from their parents, and most often placed with strangers. So that will happen scores of times just during this hour that we're together. And those kids will be really scared and confused, and so will their parents. And only a small percentage of children that are removed in the over 400,000 that are in foster care right now in the United States, we're in immediate danger or we're seriously harmed prior to that removal. That's only a small percentage. The overwhelming majority are for neglect, which can be serious, but also if we reorient our approach and our funding and our investments, a lot of neglect could be prevented. And just kind of building on this to understand the magnitude of what we've discussed so far. If you're a Black kid in the United States, you're almost 2 times as likely to be removed from your family as a white kid. And if you're Native American kid or Alaska Native kid, you're almost 3 times as likely to be taken from your family as a white kid. And if you're poor, you're always more likely. And this, as others have said, contributes, reinforces intergenerational trauma and family instability that can be crippling. And we know better, so we need to start doing better. And we've got an opportunity to do that now. And it really begins with hearing directly from those who have experienced the system about what would have helped them, what would have been a strength and support to a family that might be struggling with something, or even better, how could we help through all types of government and non-government programs and supports to help create conditions that allow families to thrive and prosper, so that certain vulnerabilities that are so present now would be less likely. And that's the moment that we're in right now, to reflect on all that's been learned, to be honest about how many of our previous efforts just to make the current system a little bit different or a little bit better, that's not stopping this harm. And it's time that we come together to do that.
Thanks, David, and thanks again to you, Shonda. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, the heaviness of all of this. This is not light, right? This is deep, heavy, harmful, traumatic stuff that we're talking about that happens to people and families every single day. So I wanted to acknowledge that because I can feel the weight of it all, and I'm sure everybody else can as well. So we've talked a lot about these policies and practices and the harm that results, and it shows up for Black, Brown, Indigenous families in the form of surveillance, right? It shows up in invasive investigations, in forced separations. It shows up in encounters with the child welfare system at all. And so I want to turn to you, Tashay, and ask you to think about policies or practices, attitudes or narratives that govern the child welfare system today. And if you can give an example or share how an attitude or policy or practice or narrative that you thought about or experienced, how that shows up in the lives of Black, Brown, or Indigenous children and families, so that we can give some concrete examples to our audience.
Thank you definitely for that question. I really want to focus on the impacts of attitudes and narratives that govern the child welfare system. Social views and narratives are at work when it comes to shaping public policy and practices. I believe that society has determined social constructs that outline what is good, what is bad, and what is a normal family. Often those ideas of a normal family is centered around whiteness, if we're being honest, and doesn't account for the lives and culture of Black and Brown Indigenous children and families. When we subscribe to these narratives, that's how we end up with the overpopulation of Black and Brown children and families within the child welfare system. And we don't end up with policies that meet their needs. I'll give you an example. I had participated in some trainings to become a CASA, and it was really intense. We really had to do some reflection. And I was the only younger Black girl at the table. And a lot of the other women were white who had recently retired. And so they didn't end up finishing the training because they could not see what a family looked like or different norms outside of their own practices. So what it might look like to live in poverty, what it might look like to adjust to different traditions that they may have deemed as unfit. And so that's an important narrative to think upon, because ultimately we implement these policies, but it's up to the discretion and the street level bureaucrats that are implementing these situations. And so I wanted to highlight that narrative, but I have to highlight another one if that's okay. I also want to bring to your attention the narrative of adultification bias, which is a form of racial prejudice where children of minority groups, but typically Black children, are treated by adults as being more mature than they actually are compared to their white counterparts. And so research reveals that society views Black girls to be more adult-like and less innocent as their white counterparts. And the study further explains that Black girls are seen as needing less nurturing, protection, and support and comfort. And that gets kind of scary. And a lot of this is centered around this systemic racism. And so Black girls are reaping the harms of this long history of racism. And so why this is important is because if you have a bias when it comes to serving Black girls and minority girls, you're less likely to give them the services they need because you're perceiving them as needing less protection, less nurturing. And some of the harsh reality is, I looked at some data and it said that like 22% of Black girls are in foster care. Out of that 22%, 35% of those Black girls will experience between 10 and 99 residential placements. When you begin to be taken from your family, relocated, you become very vulnerable to human sex trafficking. And that's a whole nother story that we can go forever on. But these narratives are very important because, like I said, these street workers or frontline workers are the ones that has discretion to implement services. And so we aren't tackling it from the top down. Families and children, especially those who are in care, are going to continuously be harmed. Thank you.
No, thank you, Tasha. Thank you for both of those examples. I think they're really important because they form those kinds of notions form the basis of a lot of policies that we develop and then those that we don't, right? So thanks for highlighting that. Alexandria, I'd love for you to sort of answer that same question in your own way. And I know you do a lot of work around, culture and identity, and Dr. Day spoke to us about erasure practices and identity development. And so if you could talk to us about an example of a policy practice attitude that you believe is carried out in the policies that we see that govern child welfare today, and how that harms Black, Brown, or Indigenous children and families.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So really, when we're thinking about young people and thinking about any families that are impacted by the child welfare system, we need to take a step back and look at those people as individuals. We need to look at what the parents need, what the kids need, because they're not the same thing. And so the biggest narrative that we see is like, okay, this family enters the child welfare system, whether they're poor, whether they're Black, or whatever they have going on, but they need X, Y, and Z. And someone's sitting at the table telling you like, hey, I don't do drugs, I just deal them. That means they don't need to go to drug therapy or go to treatment. It means you need to look at that person. And when we tie that to identity and culture development, we, as Black people, as Indigenous people, as people of color, we lose that. We lose all of our roots and everything that goes into it, whether it's our native language, whether it's our cooking, whether it's hair. You lose that when you strip those young people away from their family, from their cultural roots. So here in Kansas, I'll speak to Kansas as that's where I'm at. Our major states, cities are Wichita, Topeka, Kansas City. When you take a Black kid from Wichita, Topeka, or Kansas City and put him out in Great Bend, Kansas, or Hayes, Kansas, or Kensington, Kansas, where there's nobody that looks like them, you're opening them up to have so much harm intended to them. I remember being in care. I went from living in Wichita, Kansas to Kensington, Kansas, and my foster parents and my workers were allowed to let them shave my hair off. And if you know anything about being a Black woman, I mean, you don't have to know a lot, but you know that our hair is our crown and you don't touch our hair and you don't mess with our hair. So as a kid, looking back now as someone who's 30 years old and seeing that these practices and these narratives and these attitudes are still happening. Like, it's okay for a young person who's Black to go live with a white family and them not know how to do their hair or put lotion on their body or the needs they have, or even teach them how to be a Black person in the society. Because as we all know, there's a lot of things going on towards Black people right now. And we can get into that a different day at a different time. You're hurting that kid. I mean, my nephew called me a bald-headed Black blueberry because he was like, who in their right mind would allow somebody to do that? Like, he's 17, 18, 19, one of them ages. I got 8 of them. So, he's one of them ages. But he even seen that, and he never experienced the child welfare system. So he's seen it as like, you're taking my aunt's identity. You're taking her crown. You're taking what is joyful to her. I mean, even just on this call, all of us Black women have different hairstyles. I mean, we got locks, we got braids, we got wigs, we got natural. It's whatever we want it to be. But you don't get that when you don't look at that person as an individual. So how do you help them young people, whether they're teens or little kids, be connected to their culture? What does that look like? Does that look like making sure they have a mentor that looks like them? I give props to my last foster home before I aged out of care, because they connected me with somebody who taught me how to make soul food. They made sure that was the one thing I wanted. I said, I'm 17, about to be 18, and I don't know how to fry chicken. I don't know how to wrap my hair. I don't know how to make collard greens, and that's my culture. And this system told my parents that y'all know how to raise me better than them. So if you know how to raise me better, then where was my culture development? Where was my identity development? Where was helping me grow as a person and an individual? And we have all these theories. We have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have lifespan development. We have identity development. We got all these theories, but how are we applying those? How are we putting that to a young person's culture? Because I'll say that now that I'm older, that's the one thing that I wish the system would have made sure that was in place, was making sure my culture identity was intact. Because I'm not Black enough to hang with the Black people, and I'm not white enough to hang with the white people. So where does that leave me? And I think that's something that the narrative in this system they need to realize is Black and brown kids still need to have that culture. No matter what, we are still Black, we are still Hispanic, we are still indigenous, and we need to be able to have that. We have to have that. It's not even a need, we have to have that. We have to be able to represent and be who we are at our core.
Thank you, Alexandria. Thank you so much. Shonda, I don't know if you want to take 2 minutes to respond to something that you heard from Tashay or Alexandria. But I also want to put out there, you and I have had some discussions about racism and normalcy. And we know that a lot of these policies and practices that govern the child welfare system are based in white norms. And so if you want to say something about normalcy and this idea and how it relates to the child welfare system and what families experience, I'd love that.
Well, first of all, I just want to tip my hat to the panelists, what they've shared. Alexandria, oh my gosh, I just adore you. And I just have to say that in this moment, right? Like the connection, and when she's talking, right, I'm shaking my head because I'm like right there with you, sister. So thank you for that. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that normalcy. First of all, I want to just kind of say that we have this system that really puts in a path. There's one way to do something, and here's the one way to do it. And if you don't do it, right, we've got a problem. And that's really through the lens of whiteness, right? It's that perfectionism. And if you don't arrive there, we've got a problem. So it's never been designed to see me in my entirety and in my whole being, because I'm not white. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that happen in child welfare that happen all the time, right? Now, I want you just to think for yourself, right? As I rattle off this list, right? Like, how does this happen every single day, every 2 minutes? And it's just the status quo way we operate. Right? You remove children out of sleeping beds. You place them in back of police cars. You abruptly remove them from school. They don't know who you are. They don't know what foster care is. You take them to a stranger's house and you say, this is your new place to be. I haven't been comforted. I don't know where my mom is. I can't talk to my father, right? These are my places of protection, right? These are the places where I know that the world is okay. That's my go-to place. You remove all of these things from children, right? You remove their brothers and sisters abruptly. Where are my peeps, right? Where's my mom? Where's my dad? Where's my brother? Where's my sister? You take children. You don't even tell parents that you're taking their children. They go to pick up their children and they've been notified CPS came and got your kid, right? You'd be out of your mind. But we don't think about that when we think about parents. We say you're definitely deserve to be unaware and have your child kidnapped and not know their whereabouts. You don't know their whereabouts for months. You can't talk to them. You can't visit them because we don't have a visitation supervisor, right? And then you get all of these lists of things to do and say, hey, get in line and comply. We know where your child is. We know you don't know where your child is, but we need you to actually continue to do all of these services that really don't have anything to do with what I actually need. Because what we do know is that most families are actually in child welfare because of issues related to poverty. And we don't really address those issues. What we do is we give them the psychosocial array of services and say, go do those, right? But we never really actually even address the root causes. I want to go back to our kiddos. Right? We put our kiddos in multiple homes, multiple strangers' homes. They're sleeping in department offices, in cars, right? They're going to all these different schools. They can't make any connections, right? They have to navigate all of these different things without the comfort of their parent. And when they get to their parent, right, we've got now some paraprofessional scrutinizing and surveilling them, writing notes, right, that have an incredible amount of weight in a court proceeding. We have a CASA who comes in as a white retired person with no real formal education around parent or child development, any of these things, yet they get to write these really, weighted reports that also make a difference in court. So I just want to just sit with this question for a minute. How is that normal? How is that normal? Yet we do it every day. Think about our children and stop seeing the parent as the problem. What they need is help. They don't need to be thrust into a state of crisis, full of worry and fear if my child will ever come back to me. I'm going to end super quick. I was in a meeting yesterday, talked to this parent, and she talked about how her child was murdered in foster care. I want to throw this last piece at you. We keep on talking about how parents need to be managed, and we go with the assumption that children are better off in other people's homes. We've got some pretty compelling data also that says that's not true either. So we've got to take this information and we have to do something with this, right? We cannot no longer stand complicit. We have what we need to do something different. The question now is what will we do?
Thank you, Shonda.
You're welcome.
We have 10 minutes left, and I want to, turn to our panelists to, take a minute and a few seconds and just say something about engaging in anti-racist policymaking, taking action after everything that you've laid out here today. Alex, CSSP did a beautiful job on a guide on anti-racist policymaking. So I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, it really underscores the need for us to move forward. The information, the stories, the experiences that we've talked through today that harm, we really need to be advancing racial justice, which means taking a proactive approach to removing harmful policies that perpetuate inequities and are grounded. And instead, we need to ground our policies in principles of anti-racist policymaking. As Shireen said, CSSP has developed some guiding principles, and I'm going to share them very briefly. The first is around redressing past injustices. Anti-racist policy recognizes how racism and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in particular have shaped policies and practices historically and continue to shape our experiences today, as we've heard. We need to take action to right historical wrongs. And this is what's necessary in order to ensure that children, youth, and families have the opportunity to achieve their potential, and that children and youth grow up knowing that they and their peers belong in this nation. The second principle is about meeting the needs of children and families of color. We have to center children and families of color to ensure that they benefit directly from the policy. Policies that are purported to be colorblind or race neutral have all too frequently been designed to benefit white children and families and harm children and families of color directly and indirectly. We have to be race conscious and explicitly consider how policies impact Black, Indigenous, and other children, families, and communities of color. We have to support the whole family. And this really means for policies to effectively support children and families of color, they have to recognize how race and ethnicity intersect with class, ability, sexual orientation, and gender identity to shape people's experiences. All families have to be included in the policymaking process so that they can shape policies, solutions, and that meet their express needs. And finally, the fourth principle is that we have to serve all children and families in need. We believe that policies grounded in these principles are critical to addressing systemic racism. In the past, policies have artificially divided families between those who are deserving and those who are undeserving, providing services and support to only those that are considered deserving, right? And this just buttresses systemic racism. So we really have to think about how we support broad-based programs that are designed with children and families of color at the center to ensure that they can benefit and that the programs are in fact meeting their needs. We also need to think beyond child welfare, as we've heard today, right? We need to root solutions in community, we need to remove surveillance, and we need to prioritize keeping families together in their communities. To promote racial justice and child welfare really means we have to examine the current structure, we need to deconstruct it because its roots are grounded in racism, and we need to build with community a response that supports families. So it's tricky to talk about racial justice and child welfare because it really means doing work outside of child welfare, as folks have talked about, right? We need to have flexible dollars that allow states to invest in community-driven solutions. We need to be accountable to families and communities. We need to remove the surveillance and policing. There are some avenues to do this through 4B and other funding streams, but we also really need to think creatively and in partnership to develop additional solutions. Specifically, we need to think about real meaningful investments in communities where families are connected and feel the most supported and comfortable, and that these are not tied to systems, and in particular, the child welfare system. This is where we get to a true prevention and support for children and families.
Thank you, Alex, for all of that. All right, stay with us, those who are listening. Dr. Day, give us your 1 minute to go piece of advice for folks.
Thank you so much. We've talked a lot about how research has really, identified some of the problematic practices going on. I also want to say that research has also pointed to some wonderful solutions to these problems, and they really are centered around, community-centered design practices, and Alex referred to that a little bit. We'd love to see Congress be willing to appropriate funding necessary to support building strong communities. We have a lot to learn from innovation that has happened in Indigenous communities in particular. I want to highlight one example where many tribes have employed community outreach workers who are part of the communities in which they work. And that's really important. This idea of hiring a workforce that has familiarity with a community's personality and how that makes a difference when you're attempting to build trust with populations who have been exposed to historical traumas that have given them good reason not to trust government systems. If Black and Indigenous families are to have any trust in a government system that has the ability to remove their children from their care, the system's first interaction with the community has to be to provide resources, not remove children. Child protection needs to be seen as a shared responsibility among community members and community-based organizations. We need a national commitment to implement a community-based child welfare system.
Thank you, Dr. Day. Tasha, I'm gonna jump to you.
Real quick, I'm just going to say it takes a village to raise a child and a village to support families. And I think that Dr. Day and Alex hit the nail on the head about the solution. So I'm just going to end with that.
Thank you for that. Alexandria?
I agree. And I'm also going to say that you make sure you tap into those young people and those families that have lived experience and expertise. And when you are tapping into those people, make sure you pay them correctly and do not tokenize them because their experiences are valid. And also there's tons of organizations doing the work and they may not be big organizations, but tap into those as well. Tap into the people who are actually doing the work and showing up for these young people day in and day out.
Thank you. David?
Communities know their families the best and parents know their children the best. And we need to listen, we need to act on that. And at the federal level, we need to invest in communities and invest in families instead of being stuck in deficit mentalities where we think services are the answers to everything. I'll offer one resource that I'd like to point you to is a new journal that I've been a part of helping launch at the Family Integrity and Justice Works that names the parts of the system that cause harm and offers solutions. And some of the most creative and well-respected thinkers are contributing to that. And I would encourage everyone to look it up.
Thank you, David. Shonda, I know you had some last words. One more minute for anything else?
I've got last words. I want to just say, first of all, please stop the foster care to prison pipeline. It's astonishing. Please support the whole family. We can't carry the best interests of children and not care about their parents, right? So I'm asking you to please invest in families, in the communities that they reside in, and give our children a chance for a promising future. Thanks.
Thank you, Shonda. And thank you to all of you. I look forward to continuing this series on promoting justice and child welfare with the TAY Coalition, with our panelists that are here. And I hope that all of you will join us for the next 3 sessions or so that will take place over the next few months and round us out in 2022. Happy end of Children's Week to everybody. And happy Juneteenth to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.